Hello, welcome. I'm Cara Benedetto. I teach in the painting and printmaking department. I'm very, very happy to be here tonight to introduce Noah Simblist. There will be time for questions following the talk. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, please submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function, okay? So the way that I like to introduce people when I do introductions is to first sort of read whatever they send me, their bio, right? I like to it's the accolades where we're very impressed. And then I do some writing, and that's what you're gonna hear after that, okay? Can you guys hear me? It's so fun to be IRL. It's really fun, I love it. Okay, as a curator, writer, and artist, Noah Simblist works on the ways in which contemporary artists address history, sovereignty, and the tensions between political forces and self-determination. He edited the new book, Tanya Bruguera, The Francis Effect, with Deep Vellum in 2022, which you can buy now at the ICA, as well as Commonwealth, Publication Studio 2022, and Artists in Residence with Publication Studio in 2021. Simblist has contributed to Art in America, Art Agenda, Art Journal, Terremoto, and other publications. His curatorial projects include Commonwealth here at the ICA in 2020, Conjunctions and Disjunctions at Black Ground in Cali, Colombia, 2022, Summer Sessions, Commonwealth at the ICA at VCU 2019. That was a very busy summer, as I remember. Aissa DB, Exile is Hard Work at Birdsite University Museum in Palestine in 2017, False Flags at Pelican Bomb in New Orleans in 2016, and Emergency Measures at the Power Station in Dallas in 2015. He is an associate professor and the former chair of painting and printmaking here at VCU in Richmond. Impressive, right? Come on, let's clap. We'll clap twice. Yay, okay. All right, now it's mine. So I was really excited when Noah asked me to do this because I was like, yes, is this the moment where I get to roast Noah? Is this it? And then I was like, oh, there's not enough alcohol. So we're gonna instead, I'm going to list the ways in which Noah feeds and feels and sustains and supports us. When I say us, who is us? Us, right? This is the question. It's such a good question. Who is us? And it's a question that comes up again and again in Noah's practice. It's one that we don't ask enough. It brings us to here and now, to this particular time and place, and maybe the us or the we is, or at least holds the possibility for, a community that is based in forms of love. I don't know about you, but I felt this many times in the last 8 years that I've been here. And it's a community that Noah helped to build, because Noah is committed to building relationships through art. He is committed to learning and sharing, to the people that he reaches via collaboration, and the artists he supports and celebrates through dialogue and debate. Because one thing we know that Noah does really well is ask questions, really good questions. Sometimes when you're on the receiving end of those questions, it can feel like a little bit of a hot seat, but for the most part, they're really important. And they're important to kind of the characteristic to those who are committed to learning environments, to artists, to intellectuals, and to critical citizens of the world. I also want to mention that Noah has a beautiful writing practice. It voices critical opinions and it gives voice to forms of criticality that communicates difference, care, and furthers the conversation that all of us participate in. So I'm grateful that Noah gives us as much as he does. Please join me in welcoming Noah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Cara for that beautiful, lovely introduction, and to Vanna for all your help, and for Kelly for your help today as well. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to speed through a bunch of stuff. But the one thing I just wanted to say to start off with is that it's fitting that my lecture is on Erev Yom Kippur, a day in Jewish faith that has to do with retrospective introspection. For about 10 years, much of my work had to do with memory and memorialization, specifically as it applies to Poland, Germany, Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. But that's a very particular kind of retrospective introspection. So don't worry, I'm not going to be talking about that or older work. This isn't going to be a retrospective talk that sums up my life practice or answers the question, who am I? I tend to reserve that more for lectures that I give when I'm up for a job, or when I have to do the artificial work of packaging myself, defining myself in the ways that bios are usually written, where I am a writer, curator, educator, artist, etc. The way I see it, I'm the accumulation of past actions. So I usually rather say that I've worked as an artist or curator or writer, educator. I did consider talking about my life in general with a lecture that was titled after a memoir that I'm working on called Mixed Feelings, Falling in and Out of Belief with Judaism, Zionism, Art, and Education. But then I thought better about that, and I decided to focus on something a little bit more positive, community and collaboration. Specifically, I'm going to talk about a few recent projects from the last few years. These are complex, socially engaged practices that are research heavy in a lot of ways, and there's lots of people to credit, more than I'll be able to cite, but you can find more information on my website that was scrolling as we started. So the first project, Commonwealth, as Cara mentioned, this is a project that was here at the ICA, and it opened in the middle of the pandemic, so there were a limited amount of people who actually saw it. It was a project that was about an investigation of the term itself, of Commonwealth, something that's shared by Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Puerto Rico. When Virginia and Pennsylvania were established in the 18th century, the idea was to refer to a model of government that was about the common good, as opposed to the good of the king or the good of empire. But in 1952, when Puerto Rico was established as a commonwealth, the phrase began to become a sign of it being a colony of the United States. In essence, one form of empire replaced another. So we were interested in the tension between the utopian promise of the term and the failures of that promise. And we did so by collaborating with, who is this we? Who is us? It's a lot of people in terms of this project. It included 3 institutions, and brought a lot of people together. And at its core was collaboration in many senses. So I was first invited by Stephanie Smith, the former curator here at the ICA, to be part of this project. We then reached out to the Philadelphia Contemporary and then Beta Local, which is based in San Juan. In all 3 places, we had some form of community engaged process to think through the term as a starting point for our research. So here, Stephanie and I co-taught a course between this room and the atrium that was with VCU students through VCUarts in spring 2019. So then in the summer of 2019, we launched Summer Sessions Commonwealth in the ICA's first floor galleries. It was designed by a team based between Bogota and New York. And the idea was to have a flexible space with colored curtain walls that could host performances, workshops, and lectures. It was conceived of as a public form of learning. Each week we had a theme like natural resources. The walls of the gallery were filled with texts and traces of these workshops, or the built environment. We invited urban planners to think through our community, through the community of Richmond, through charrettes about a parcel of land near Gilpin Court, run by the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. We toured the Virginia Capitol. We did walking tours along the river to talk about its geopolitical history. It involves so many people and so many things both inside and out of the museum, but it really helped us to start to crystallize what would eventually become an exhibition. So the exhibition itself included new commissions by 10 artists. The show was supposed to open in the fall of 2020, but in the spring and summer of 2020, as we saw the lockdowns and cancellations as a result of the pandemic, we decided to locate the exhibition only in Richmond. Because in San Juan and Philadelphia, they were both supposed to be public projects in partnership with a number of organizations. It was actually too challenging because of the lockdown. Puerto Rico, for instance, was under absolute lockdown. People couldn't even leave their houses for long periods of time. We also pivoted so that half of the show actually ended up being on the outside of the museum and half of it was on the inside, because as we were planning, the ICA was still shut down. We weren't sure when we were going to get in, but we went through with it to see, just basically to hedge our bets. So that included this mural by Fairleigh Baez, or this set of murals on the right by Monica Rodriguez. We also commissioned a community garden by Duran Chavez. And one of the most popular projects that we actually did as a part of the show, most of the press actually covered this. Duran, as many people know, he's been engaged with the ICA and the Richmond community for a long time. At this point, he had just left his full-time job and he had started a grassroots effort of distributing raised beds. So in lockdown, when people were talking about how do we get groceries, how do we get food, like we're supposed to stay at home, but how do we feed ourselves? He started thinking about training people how to grow their own food. And so the idea was to use the platform of the ICA to create visibility to this initiative, to demonstrate the simple solution to not only the needs of COVID in the immediate environment, but also to think about the larger questions around food deserts and heat islands and the relationships to the histories of redlining and environmental social justice in Richmond. So then at the end, we had basically set up these raised beds in the parking lot right next to the ICA. But then at the end of the exhibition, the raised beds and fruit trees were redistributed throughout the rest of the city for free. Other artists included Carolina Caicedo, where she did a lot of research on water bonds in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Puerto Rico. She was interested in thinking about how natural resources can be commodified. We worked with a VCU history student who became her intermediator with a set of archives here in Virginia. And then that work through those curtains by Carolina is a work by Tanya Lucan Linklater based on indigenous architecture. She had collaborated with an architect named Tiffany Shaw Collins, and this piece of sculpture was really meant to work with dancers. It was a kind of set piece, a prop, a piece of architecture that was supposed to work in direct relationship to the body. We were going to have a performance here, but one of the things that shifted as a part of COVID is we ended up doing she ended up making a performance for camera that was filmed in Canada, and then she sent the video to us. Another work in this show included a video by Sharon Hayes, where she interviewed an all-women tackle football team in Dallas. And then a new commission by Alicia Diaz and many, many other people who were collaborators on this, including David Riley here at the ICA. It was shot in a former tobacco factory in Richmond, which actually was the site of the same company that had a tobacco factory in Puerto Rico, where the labor organizer and Puerto Rican feminist Luisa Capatilla and Afro-Puerto Rican nationalist leader Dominga de la Cruz had worked. The film used their writings as the narration to link the two places. And you can actually see the whole film on the ICA's YouTube page. We also commissioned the Conciliation Project, which Dr. T from VCUarts Theater, as well as Ram Bhagat, who I think is going to be here talking on Thursday, organized a play that was about monuments in Richmond. And the Conciliation Project, this project that Dr. T works on, really starts with a question, and then they do a really elaborate and very mindful community engagement process, sort of asking members of the community about an idea. They then transcribe those interviews and turn that into a script, which they then used as the basis for the play. We also commissioned this projection by this LGBTQ organization, Southerners on New Ground, or SONG. And they designed a projection on the outside of the ICA that was inspired by the racial justice protests in the summer of 2020, specifically advocacy for the legacy of Marcus David Peters. One of the things that was kind of really important for us was to think about the particular resonance of this site, because this intersection that we're at Belvedere and Broad was the site of a number of really intense clashes between protesters and police in the summer of 2020. So this wasn't just a kind of unsighted art object that was displayed in a museum. It was something that was a demand that actually was resonant with the actual site on which it was projected. In the Commonwealth book, which I'll talk about in a second, there's a long conversation between a couple of the organizers in our discussions with VCU Legal, which allowed us to actually do this, which was a very illuminating process. So, as I mentioned, the book became the archive of the project. It was published by, it was designed by the Puerto Rican-based Higuera Corporation. Initially, we transferred to an online format that actually just closed. And the idea initially, like in the early stages, March, April, May of 2020, was that who knows if people are going to be able to get out. This was a strategy that some museums were starting to use, was thinking about online platforms as ways to kind of transpose an artist project into. So we did that, but then eventually there was a kind of ephemerality to that, and we eventually decided to create the book as an archive. It's in a limited run, but it is available in the ICA shop. It was published in English and Spanish, so you can choose to get either the Spanish version or the English version, or both. This was an ethic in translation that we used throughout the whole project, where all the didactics and most of the programming allowed for both Spanish and English translation. A side project that came out of this was this other book called Artists in Residence. As we were deep in conversations about how to kind of shift the whole project into something else, reckoning with what was happening in the United States and the world, and how we could shift an artist project that is all about communing people together and do it in a way that accounted for the lockdown. We came up with this idea to invite 50 artists, including Cara and some other people from here in Richmond. They each were giving, they basically gave us instructions, like one would give the rules for a game, of what to do when sheltering in place. So outside of Commonwealth, this other recent project, a book that I edited, was published this past summer, and it was about Tanya Bruguera's project, The Francis Effect. The performance itself happened in 2014, and the book was meant to kind of archive but also extend the conversations that were embedded within the work, which is, what are the limits of art? What is the relationship between art and life, art and politics, and how far performative and conceptual gestures can be pushed before an art project ceases to be art at all? And is that necessarily a bad thing? So the project is pretty simple. It is a performance in the guise of a political campaign to ask Pope Francis to grant all stateless people citizenship in Vatican City. Its primary structure is the gathering of signatures. Participants were asked to sign a card and choose one or two options. They could say either, I want to apply for Vatican City citizenship, or I request that Vatican City citizenship be granted to immigrants. So it was performed first in New York, LA, and Dallas. That's because it was co-produced by the Guggenheim in New York, Santa Monica Museum, which is now the ICALA, and my former institution, Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And we had each invited her for a project, and she basically asked us to come together and to work together on one thing. So she brought us together. The thing has since been reperformed in other places when she's been invited at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, at Nuit Blanche in Toronto, and in a recent survey exhibition in Milan. So far, 20,000 postcards and counting have been gathered. The original design identity was made by Buro Buro, which is a Mexico City-based design firm that Lucia San Roman, one of the co-curators, engaged. The final design for the book was made by Cristina Paoli, who's also Mexico City-based. And one thing that's interesting is that the color that was tied to the branding of the Francis Effect it's shifted over time, and it's been used by many designers and institutions. As I mentioned, she keeps on working with different institutions and extending the project, but it's always been within the range of the UN Pantones. And the thing that's interesting, I found an interview with the lead graphic designer for the UN, who's been very frustrated about the fact that actually every single UN agency uses a slightly different Pantone for what UN Blue is. But actually we became kind of interested in that, like the multiplicity of actually bringing people together speaks very well of the multiplicity of thinking about questions around immigration. So what is a book? I'm asking this question because just in the past year or so, these 3 books are things that I've been making. This Tania Bruguera book that I worked on basically for 8 years, even though it's so small, it sort of took a lot of time. I'm a big believer that books are another platform, like an exhibition or a performance for discourse, not just because of the excuse of something like COVID, but actually something that can exist in its own right. And I actually really love how Egbert and the team here at the ICA have really embraced this idea through projects like doing language work, or even Raphael's project that's on the 3rd floor right now. The art historian Ariela Aisha Azulay talks about photographs or documents as instruments for civic engagement. They give us a proposal for our social life to negotiate and debate, which is one of the definitions of politics. I think of books in a similar way, not as an archive that is dormant or information to be passively taken in, but as a two-way engagement. I think that this book is an opportunity for thinking about how it is a platform for civic engagement for communities of readership. And in many ways, this is in keeping with Tania's practice. So it was published by Deep Vellum Books, which is a small press in Dallas. The structure of the book is essentially that I wrote the introduction to give the logic of the book. Tania has an essay about how the Francis Effect emerged from her wider practice about immigration. There's a curator conversation talking about how it played out in different cities. Our Literal Speed is an art historical analysis of the project. Saskia Sassen writes about borders and globalization, and Nicholas Terpstra about the history of the church. So the project started in New York in the summer of 2014. It originally was a part of a group show called Under the Same Sun, Art in Latin America from Latin America Today, curated by Pablo Leon de la Barra. Christina Yang was the director of public programs there at the time, and since this was a socially engaged project that involved direct engagement with the public, she was asked to be the lead on the project, just in terms of the bandwidth of the curatorial team. And one thing to note is that Christina has a long history with performance, working with the Kitchen in New York and completing a PhD in performance studies at NYU. And I'm actually interested in this tendency within museums that a curator of public programs is the one who works on the socially engaged project as opposed to the main curator of the show. And that actually is a phenomenon that's actually quite common. So just in terms of practice, this image on the left was pretty typical. Signatures were gathered at the entrance of the museum with people waiting in line or walking by. So Tanya would sort of engage people saying, hey, would you like to, I'm Tanya Bruguera, I'm a part of this thing, the Guggenheim Museum, part of this exhibition, I'm doing this project. And then would start to ask people if they would sign the petition one way or the other. But to do that begins a conversation around immigration. For some people, it often was like yes or no, but often, especially if it was a no, she had to try to engage them of why it was a no, who they are, where they're from, what their resistance might have been. And actually, I think that the form of the work actually is in that conversation. There's an art historian named Grant Kester who has this book called Conversation Pieces, where he talks about the form, like the formalism of conversation, that there's different kinds of conversation that one can have, and the form that they have actually can be really impactful. So when the same project happened in Los Angeles, it was in the context of an exhibition called Citizen Culture that was curated by Lucia San Roman, who was brought in as a guest curator. And it included other artists like Suzanne Lacey, Teddy Cruz, and Laurie Jo Reynolds. And the basis of it was how do artists shape public policy. Laurie Jo Reynolds, who is there on the top left, together with Tanya signing, worked on, she's an artist, a socially engaged artist who worked on a project called the TAMS Project, which was a campaign to end solitary confinement for prisoners in the TAMS Supermax prison in just outside of Chicago. But when Laurie signs this postcard, it's actually from one artist organizer to another, one socially engaged artist to another. And the thing that's kind of interesting is that there's hope potentially that this absurd request of Tanya's to the Pope to grant citizenship for stateless people in Vatican City might be not so crazy, because Laurie's campaign actually was successful. Like an artist was able, after a 10-year project, a 10-year campaign, to close the TAMS Supermax prison in 2013. So when we staged the project in Dallas, the reason for it was that she had been awarded something called the Meadows Prize, which was $50,000 in 2013 for a residency that included engagement with students and the community, and then some form of public project. So at the time, I was the chair of the art department, and I was asked to lead the project, both the engagement with students, but also the public project. And since we didn't have a traditional museum, no bricks and mortar, the performance had to be sited throughout public spaces. And I had to do all this work to try to figure out like who would host us, asking permission ahead of time. So I tried to use this public park, but like many things in Dallas and in America, the public park isn't actually public. It was actually a private park that was run by a 501c3 organization based on donations from private individuals. And so, and at the end of the day, I asked permission and was denied permission for us to stage the performance there. So we had to stay on the sidewalk, which technically was public space where we had freedom of speech as our kind of legal cover. But we couldn't actually step onto the grass. And the minute that we stepped onto the grass, security was ready to kind of like usher us back onto the sidewalk. And we also didn't have the framework of a museum. So we had to do a lot more work to convince people that this was art. So one of the great gifts that the Dallas Arts District gave us is that there is a Catholic church, the largest Catholic church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, is across the street from the Nasher Sculpture Center and the Dallas Museum of Art. And we tried to engage this church to see if we could collect signatures after Mass. On both Saturdays and Sundays, they have thousands of people come to Mass. They have, I think, 10 back-to-back Masses all day in both Spanish and English. This is Tanya essentially stalking the priest because we had tried to get a meeting with him ahead of time to let us gather signatures. We even waited for him just outside his office the day before, but he kept on getting people to usher us out of the building. And actually when we were outside, same thing, we had to stay on the sidewalk. That sort of brick area over there was technically their property, so we couldn't cross over. They had their own version of security to make sure that we stayed on the sidewalk. And we heard from some students who snuck into the Mass that he was telling all of the parishioners not to sign anything. They had nothing to do with the church. They had nothing to do with the capital C church or their church, and that they shouldn't engage us in any way. We did get a bunch of people despite that. And then on the right is us trying to gather signatures in this Mexican-American neighborhood in South Dallas. We did okay there for a little while, but then we were eventually kicked out by security. This is the security guard, the second guy from the right. He basically said, I'll wait an hour till I ask my supervisor, but they're gonna say no. So we gave him a t-shirt as thanks. Both as a way to describe the structure of the book, but also as a kind of background to what this project was. Tanya's Francis Effect really grew out of a much longer term engagement with immigration called the Immigrant Movement International. And specifically, her notion of politically timing specific works. This is a play on site specificity, but shifting space to time. So rather than focusing on physical or geographic or social conditions of a space, she refers to a moment in time that can be shaped by policy, propaganda, journalism, or public opinion. Her reaction immediately about immigration began with her own story, but she really started thinking about doing something about it as an artist after the 2005 riots in Paris that were primarily about strife within an immigrant community on the outskirts of the city. She had moved there after living in the US. She originally came to the United States for MFA in Chicago. And one of the things that she encountered in Chicago was this kind of double discrimination, because in Cuba, if you leave, there's a kind of discrimination of why are you leaving us? And then in the US, of what she said is that so many people thought that she was from any number of Latin American countries. But at the same time, she recognized her own privilege as a Cuban in the United States because of the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1966, which allows Cubans to be eligible for permanent residency 1 year after touching US soil. So this is a tension that exists within the Latinx community in the United States and something that she felt complicit in. So she left the United States for many of these reasons. Was in Paris, she was like, I'm moving on, I'm gonna be in Europe. And then she gets a call from Creative Time to do a project in New York. And she then had them reach out to the Queens Museum and say, what if we started a political party, like a party for immigrants so that immigrants could have representation in government? She had already started this in the EU, starting in city, national, and national government in France, and then trying to work with EU politics. It had kind of gone somewhere, but nothing sustainable. So she was interested in thinking about what it would mean to come back to the United States to do that. So the first thing the Creative Time did is she sat down with their lawyers, and they said, you can't have a political party because if so, our 501c3 status would be removed. So what if it's not a party, it's just a movement? So that's how the title Immigrant Movement International began, as opposed to it being a party of immigrants. And what she set up was this storefront in Corona, Queens, which is this tremendously diverse immigrant neighborhood in New York. And they hosted workshops around healthcare, education, feminism, legal status, but also ways, basically a platform to exchange culture, including music and food. But this moment, she started that in 2010, and then Pope Francis becomes Pope in 2013. He's the first Latin American Pope. Obama meets with the Pope. The Pope goes to Lampedusa, this island in Italy where many immigrants from the Middle East and Africa were coming from. Many had died in the process. And this was creating a lot of civic strife within Europe. And the Pope had kind of begun to gently intervene in the conversation. And so coming out of her notion of politically timing specific work, she thought that the sort of notion of hope associated with Obama, and also the fact that Pope Francis was the first Latin American Pope, would potentially show interest in the issue. So she adapted some of the techniques that were tied to the immigrant movement to Francis' effect. One thing that she notes in her essay is that Immigrant Movement International was something that was fraught with the tension of what does it mean when an artist makes a project that is meant to work in a genuine way with the community, in a sustainable way with the community, that in essence is an artwork becoming an institution. And so this raises a question of short-term versus long-term artistic projects. And like, how does one build sustainability for community engagement work to be productive? What does it mean for an institution to be an artwork? And what does it mean for an artwork to be a living thing that must engage with communities and people that need to be cared for? We didn't have an answer. The art historian Our Literal Speed is a collective whose bio is, quote, a text and art undertaking located in Selma, Alabama since 2006, unquote. So I had to first approach Matthew Jesse Jackson, who is an art historian at the University of Chicago, but he preferred his work to be identified in relationship to this collective. He asked to be credited in relationship to his collective because he told me, quote, it's about not accepting that I must use my scholarship as a form of personal advancement and professional success. I want the ideas to exist, but I don't want credit for them as an individual professional scholar, unquote. So I honored this in the book and will be honoring this here by using the pronouns they, them to refer to the author that is once an individual and a collective. So they argue that Tanya's work has been formed by her earlier experience in Cuba through communism and Catholicism. They say that the political nature of her work is an expression of this early education, not only in the values of communism, but also the idea of revolution, and for her, its failures, and the fact that this revolution was reduced to a dictatorship. But what she learned about how the Castro regime used political theater, like these images from a famous speech by Castro, in which he used doves representing the Holy Spirit, turned her into making an artwork of her own. In her work, Tottling's Whisper No. 6, Havana version from 2009, she does two things. She creates a representation of the historical moment of Castro's speech so that the work is about this image, a particular kind of aesthetics and politics. But then she set it up so that the audience is also invited to speak into the microphone for 1 minute and to say anything, which in Cuba is absolutely illegal and not allowed in any sense. But in this sense, the aesthetics are just a platform for politics to be presented, not just represented. This was an example of what Tanya calls art utile, or useful art, when it intervenes in the real. So picking up on this, Our Literal Speed says, quote, if the Francis effect ceases to be art, then it would be her greatest work of art. So the sociologist Saskia Sassen takes on the issue of migration. She's a sociologist based in Columbia, New York, Columbia University in New York. And she is thinking about how migrations happen, or posits that migrations happen in systems like colonial empires, but now they've become multinational corporations, which become an extension of geographies of empire. So she asks, what causes migration, and looks at two case studies. So one is Central America, thinking about the shift in agriculture policy from small landholders to large corporations, and then looking at immigration that happened as a result from rural locations to cities, but then finding that cities didn't have the infrastructure for this population shift. There were no jobs, and then this new rural set of immigrants, of internal migrants, get caught in drug battles, and thus prompting the first major flow starting in 2013. She then looks at the Rohingya, a Muslim minority in Myanmar, in which the military dictatorship burned 350 rural villages, displacing them for development projects, often in partnership with China. What she was interested in is that the narrative in the press is often about religion, but actually she claims that it has much more to do with development. And then the last essay is by Nicholas Terpstra, this historian of religion, historian of the church. And he charts a couple of things that have to do with what he calls the Francis paradox. So in 2016, Pope Francis brought 12 Syrian refugees from the Greek island of Lesbos to Rome as a kind of symbolic gesture. The Vatican, he says, is a state without a nation. It succeeds the papal state, which functioned more like a nation. But today, the Vatican has diplomats, a bank, media, passports, and the Swiss Guard. In that sense, he says that it's like a small state like Singapore, Monaco, or Liechtenstein. But what he says is that going back to the 15th and 17th centuries, in the 17th centuries, the first people to be called refugees were Protestant Christians who fled the Catholic Church persecution in France, the Huguenots. And this echoed the 15th century during the Spanish Inquisition, which led to Jewish and Muslim refugees. So in this sense, the Catholic Church for many centuries has actually created or made the refugee crisis worse. But the Enlightenment changed some of this when the church had less power, and the separation between church and state within these new nation states meant that it didn't have the power to solve the refugee crisis whole cloth. But what he claims is that if it could use its influence, it could address centuries of wrong. So the Francis effect had many iterations. This is a shot from the survey exhibition that Lucia San Roman organized of Tanya's work at the Yerba Buena Center in San Francisco in 2017. And here you can see the Immigrant Movement International and the Francis effect bound together in this exhibition design, which is both a representation of these projects and a platform for conversations around immigration. So for that project, Tanya made a box to carry the postcards here on the left, which is now where the project lies. The book and this box capture the discourses and ideas that it's engaged. It functions kind of as an open question. I had this conversation with her more recently, sort of, she has claimed that technically it's an ongoing project, it didn't finish. But I think given her idea of timing specificity, she thinks that in many ways the moment is lost. So this becomes an archive of a potential solution. So I'm going to run through a couple things quickly. This is an exhibition that I did called Conjunctions and Disjunctions at Black Ground in Cali, Colombia. It included an amazing group of artists that are all tied to VCU. I had planned to travel to Cali in February to visit an old friend and collaborator, Beatriz Balanta. We had met in Dallas when we both taught at SMU. She was in the art history department and specialized in Latin American and African diasporic art. She recently quit her tenure track job at SMU in Dallas and wrote a piece about it called The Hidden Costs of the Life of the Mind. I suggest it. If you want a copy, I'll send it to you. She moved back to Cali, where she grew up to start a cultural space called Black Ground that focuses on the African diaspora. And at one point she joked that I should organize a show for the space, and I took her up on it, and 3 days later we had one. But one major rule was that there was no budget for shipping or travel, and thus it had to fit in a suitcase on a flight that I'd booked with Miles. So it basically was mostly video and small multiples. The second thing was that following the mission of the organization, all the artists had to have a relationship with the African diaspora. And I started by asking recent VCU alumni. So it ended up being a show of mostly African-American artists showing in an African-Colombian context. The show's title, quoting from a book by Octavio Paz, called Disjunctions and Disjunctions, was meant to signal the questions of how these lived experiences or political positions could be similar or different. The artist's work that we showed included work by Larissa Rogers, Luis Vasquez, Chino Amobi, and even Brian Castro's work, which was a print that was done in conjunction with the ICA, also available in the ICA shop. And also work by Lucchesa, Bram from Verissimo, Sandy Williams, Malcolm Peacock, and Guy Besson. So Bea and I also had started working on an essay that we had started before the exhibition project in the spring of 2021. It was published just recently for March International, but we were looking in the spring of 2021 how Colombia and Palestine both had these popular uprisings that were happening at the same time. And we asked ourselves, like, what was similar or different about these situations? In Colombia, these protests were sparked by the raising of taxes, mostly crushing the lower class, and it prompted especially Afro-Brazilian and indigenous communities to protest systemic marginalization. And interesting, Cali is a city that has a larger proportion of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous communities as compared to more elite settings like Bogota. So at the same time in Palestine, the thing that had sparked those most recent protests were related to housing demolitions by the Israeli military in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. We noticed moments like this Instagram post here on the right that signaled a kind of solidarity between the two struggles. But we also noticed a kind of formal similarity that existed within the protests themselves. Burning tires, a lone mass protester on the street with tear gas, the use of water cannons by police and the military against protesters. But we also were interested in these self-conscious uses of protest as a form of political theater in Palestine. On the left is a group of Palestinians dressed as the Na'vi from the movie Avatar at this weekly protest that would happen in the West Bank in an area called Bilin. They were usually protesting the building of what the Israeli authorities called the separation barrier. It's basically mostly a concrete wall, in some cases some kinds of fencing. And they were protesting where it was being built because it was going to divide between basically where people lived and their farmland. And then on the right is a group of fire breathers in Gaza. And we asked, what is the political potency of the carnivalesque? At the same time, in Cali, there was a group of queer protesters that would vogue and dance as a kind of political disruption. So I'm going to read you a short excerpt of our essay. This is Pantera. Pantera's booty shake sexualized the shield, centralizing the act of protest, and positioned the Black queer trans body in dangerously close proximity to an instrument of state terror. A riot shield is a prosthesis and a double-edged sword. It was designed to protect state actors, the police, from projectiles thrown at them by protesters. As such, it embodies the will of the state to protect itself and the status quo. The shield is also part of an aggressive structure of containment. Kettling, the police tactic of surrounding protesters to corral them in place or to move the crowd to particular places, is an example of how riot gear, including helmets, batons, shields, knee pads, and groin protectors, is part of a machinery created to squash the actions and dreams of insurgent subjects fighting against the necropolitics of the state. The buttocks are a wall as well. A shield for the anus, an aperture of vulnerability. The anus is the site of the entanglement of pleasure and pain, and when the buttocks bounce around it, they vibrate to illuminate its aura. In making the shield part of the dance performance, Pantera inserts this violent object into a different logic of power and signification. Pantera transforms it into a toy, a sex toy, an object of enjoyment. Given the history of police violence against racialized bodies coded as sexually deviant, Pantera's bootylicious play with this violent gadget is a daring act of defiance. In Colombia, as in many other places, police torture queer people through sexual violations that often include the forceful introduction of batons, guns, and other objects into the anus. In this context, Pantera's performative gesture, rimming the shield as it were, destabilizes, if only for a moment, the vicious use of the instrument. Later that day, Pisces, Nova, and Axid vogued at the Plaza Bolivar, the seat of the Colombian government, while other protested danced to the rhythm of drums. These dance performances became iconic moments in the aesthetics of protest in Colombia. They were also packaged for consumption at news by international media outlets such as the New York Times. So we, unquote, we had to keep changing the essay because the politics kept changing on the ground. Sadly, not so much in the case of Palestine, but in Colombia, there was a new leftist government that was elected in June 2022, a year from these protests that we started to look at and think about. And those protests were credited as a major turning point in the politics of that country. So one thing is, maybe if Colombia can do it, we can too. Thanks. So I think we have time for questions or comments.
Can I ask you about your interaction with Tanya? How did it change? Because it's very rare where somebody works with one artist for like 8 years. It's very long term. So how did it change and how did it start?
Well, first, it's not rare with Tanya. I once went to that survey show at the Yerba Buena Center. She was running a school of art util there, and by definition, it had to be a durational project. But often Tanya will start a durational project, but leaves or sort of has someone else finish it. But she broke her leg by accident, and so was kind of forced to be like there in school the whole time. So it was this tremendous opportunity, not just for the students, and she was incredible to have this like long scale engagement with the School of Art Util. But I was actually a part of this group of curators who were sort of going there because they knew that that they could make a plan to be there and she wouldn't be elsewhere. Which included this curator from MoMA and another one from the Tate who were planning further projects with her. And I ended up doing the same thing, like following her to those projects to like ask her to finish her essay, for instance. And I think that many things changed. I mean, one of the reasons why it took 8 years was that not long after we started our initial performance that was supposed to culminate in this book, Obama had reached out to Cuba to initiate a kind of normalization of relations. And she saw that as another politically timing specific moment to restage that Tutlin's Whisper project, but she was going to do it not in that was originally in the context of the Havana Biennial. She was going to do it in a public square, Revolution Square, and to restage it again. And she did it very publicly. It was a project, her first sort of social media project called #Yo También Exijo, We Also Demand. And she was very public about it by definition. And they arrested her in Havana. And she was interrogated and basically it was a combination of prison, house arrest, beatings, et cetera, that lasted for a long time. And then finally she got out, and then every time she went back, she would do something else that would get her arrested. And most recently she left Cuba and probably can't return for a long time. So the nature of our practice really changed a long time, but it had everything to do with her trying to engage in very directly with the political moment. So often when a curator or an artist or any kind of organizer or an artist work on a project together, there's plans and timelines and ideally goals. And with her, it was very difficult because it was constantly a moving target in relationship to her larger goals, the political goals. And at one point, she really said that I think that many of the other works, including the immigration work, was sort of secondary to her primary work, which was really regime change in Cuba. She's still working on that. Anyone else? Yeah.
Good evening. I was wondering if any accolades from the Francis effect reached the Pope, or did he react to that, or what was there even your intention?
We weren't able to get an in to the Pope. We tried various angles, people who had connections to the Vatican. The closest that she got was that she stood in line one day to get close to him and sort of like held up like a banner. But she was never able to get an audience with the Pope. One of the reasons that she wanted to wait until she got an audience as opposed to sort of sending a FedEx, to the Vatican, was that, there's a kind of, she wanted to use the proper structures of Vatican propriety, but also diplomatic policy, where like one is granted an audience, one gives a gift, one engages in a conversation. That's sort of the way that political negotiation would work, including a kind of request to the Vatican. So because she wasn't able to get that kind of audience, she was never able to get inside. She has heard through the grapevine that other people surrounding him thought it was an interesting idea, but of course no one wanted to go on the record.
We have a question from the virtual audience.
Oh, great.
Are you also involved in Richmond, Virginia issues of white supremacy, LBGT rights, reproductive freedom, etc.?
I mean, I think that the most direct example of that had to do with the work that I did with Commonwealth. And one of the things that I really found really valuable was that I sort of learned about my local community through this project, and created a sort of a network of people that I could begin to think about longer term engagements with some of those issues through that. It's one of the great opportunities, I think, of a public institution like the ICA is that, in many, when the building was built, the whole narrative was there's one entrance to the university and one to the city, and so it sort of functions in this way that is sort of maybe potentially intellectual and maybe inward-looking, and then one that's very public. And I felt like for myself, it was helpful for me to know where to take next steps. So even during the protests of 2020, that I could sort of track a network more easily of what was happening when and how to support and how to engage in different ways. I think that the engagement with Song was actually really useful as an organization that's tied to LGBTQ advocacy work here in Richmond and in the South in general. I thought it's really interesting that it's speaking from the South as a space of ownership of this position, as opposed to one that is necessarily marginalized. Anyone else?
This is kind of a general question, but thoughts about sort of perils and/or virtues and/or ways you can really be helpful as a curator looking to engage in and support kind of politically minded arts and politically oriented projects.
You mean sort of emerging curators, or?
Well, yeah, it could be emerging or it could be established.
Yeah.
What are the things that as a curator you learned through your experience in trying to work with
Yeah. It's funny. I don't consider myself an expert in that regard. So I think so. I don't have like a pat answer. So I do think that that I fall back on both the title of this event and sort of some of the ways that Cara was sort of outlining my practice is that my instinct is to rely on conversation, collaboration, and community as a way to begin to ask difficult questions. Like to first of all identify the difficult questions, and then to engage with communities that that are most appropriate to like ask those questions together with. And so for my own purposes, I've been sort of constantly building a network actually to sort of help me like ask those questions, so that I can continue to have those conversations. And that's what I usually suggest to students as well, that so often in the marketing of MFA programs, one talks about networks as something that is, I think it's often like, structured like the culture industry. It's something that's a very passive relationship that you are consumed into success. But actually, I think that a network is something that is, built around mutuality, that is about like sharing experience, that even challenges one another. And that network is the only possible productive space for political questions, but all sorts of questions moving forward. Okay, thanks everyone.